Hi everyone and welcome back to Story of the World Highlights. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 2 of Book 4. Now Chapter 2 of Book 4 brings us two important events. The first one is the reopening of Japan to the west, and the second is the Crimean War. So let's get started with Japan. So as you can see here, Japan had their borders closed for a long time. We learned about this in our previous book. They did this out of fear of Catholicism, because they were afraid that if Catholic missionaries entered and spread Catholicism, then soon armies from those Catholic countries would come to protect the missionaries. And eventually those countries, those Catholic countries like Spain, might try to take over Japan. They really didn't want this, so they cut their borders to the west to try and stop any influence of Catholicism. Now, they were happy and to themselves for many, many years, but eventually the West wanted into Japan. They had access to natural resources like coal, which we know is needed for steam engines, and they had other materials and resources that the West wanted to trade with. So the first Western country to try to really get them to reopen was the U.S. The U.S. made two attempts at this. The first attempt, they sent a very friendly diplomat to go and try to sweet talk and convince the Japanese to reopen. But the Japanese saw this really friendly ambassador as weak, not threatening, and they ignored him. And the U.S. said, okay, fine. First we tried to be nice. Now we'll go the scary route. And so they decided to force Japan to reopen with showing their power and strength. They sent a captain named Captain Matthew Perry, and they went in some giant ships powered by steam engines, and they sailed to Japan. When the Japanese saw these boats, they called them the Black Ships. They were big metal ships, and they thought that they were on fire because of the smoke coming out of them. And what was even more scary than just their appearance of being on fire was that along the board of the boat was a bunch of military with guns and everything pointed at the Japanese. Pretty strong message there. Some Japanese tried to board the ship to find out what was happening, but Matthew Perry was not playing around. And he said, I will only give the letter from my president about the foreign business we have to somebody of high ranking, maybe somebody like the emperor. Now, the Japanese thought about this, and they figured that the U.S. didn't really understand how their emperor and shogun system worked. So they just, to figure out what was in the letter, they had a local governor of the area nearby to pretend to be the emperor. And Matthew Perry, convinced that this guy was of high ranking, went and met with him and delivered the letter. He delivered it with a whole marching band and his whole army to really show the strength of the U.S. And the letter basically said, you have 1 year to reopen your borders, or we're going to come and force you to open them. The Japanese knew right away that they had no chance of winning a battle against these black ships and new modern warfare technology that the West had. So the Japanese knew they had to surrender. And that they did. A year later, Matthew Perry returned, and the trade treaty between the U.S. and Japan was signed. When other European countries heard about this, they jumped right in line and said, us too, we want a trade treaty. And that is how Japan reopened its borders to the west. Now, this was a pretty easy part of the chapter. Second one is a little bit more complicated. So the Crimean War takes place in the Middle East, right around the Ottoman Empire's area. In this area, the Ottoman Empire owned all here. And the Ottoman Empire, part of their territory, included a really special location known as Palestine. Palestine, right here. Palestine is important to Christians. So it's important to Christians because it is the location of many places in the Bible and many places that Jesus went. And so there were very important cities such as Jerusalem and Bethlehem. These cities, because they are so important to Christians, Christians constantly travel there. Christians constantly want to make sure they're protected, those areas. They're of high importance. And the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, owned that land. And even though they were Muslim, they didn't necessarily believe Jesus is the Son of God. They knew that it was super important to the Europeans who were mostly Christian. And so they knew that they had to keep those areas open and accessible to Europe. Another important area in the Ottoman Empire at the time was this little city right here known as Constantinople, or also known as Istanbul, the newer name. The city is important because, as you can see, it is the connection between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. There is a straight or narrow passageway between the two seas in which boats can travel. So anybody who does not have access to the Mediterranean Sea, but has access to the Black Sea, could potentially go through Constantinople and access the Mediterranean Sea, which opens into the ocean. So that is a very important sea to have control over, or that area to have control over. The last place you need to know in this map before we get started on the details is number 4, Sevastopol. Sevastopol is the Russian port city and the Russian access to the Black Sea, where the Russians had most of their warships and navy stationed. So now that you know those 4 locations, what's the other background you need to know? Well, like I said, the Turks owned access to those very important 2 holy cities and to that important connector between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, Constantinople. They knew that Europeans really wanted to make sure that those 2 holy cities were taken well care of. And so the Turks agreed to let the European countries help take care of those cities. Now, back to Constantinople, I already told you that the Russians really wanted to have access between those 2 seas, because otherwise Russia had very limited access to the Mediterranean Sea and the ocean. However, France really was scared of Russia getting this access, because if Russia got this access, France worried Russia's power would grow, and it was already big enough. Russia also knew that it couldn't take over Constantinople without help. And so they tried to convince the British Empire to come and join them in getting access. They told the British Empire, listen, Queen Victoria, if you help me get access to Constantinople, then I will share the profits with you. However, Great Britain did not think kindly of the Russians. They thought the Russians were barbaric and savage and old style and not civilized. So they were not interested in doing business with Russia. Japan, seeing that its arch nemesis, Britain, was refusing to help Russia, said, ooh, maybe the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Maybe we can partner together. So for the first time in many, many years, France and England partnered together in case there would be an invasion of Constantinople by the Russians. So how did this all lead to a war? Well, in that holy city of Bethlehem, there is the Church of Nativity. And in this church, that was believed that Jesus went there, and so it's very important to have access to make sure it stays in tip-top shape to Christians. To have control over this church and who would be in charge of taking care of it, the Turks thought about giving it to the French. But at the idea of this, the Russians said, absolutely not. If the French get it, then I'm going to start a war against you guys. And so then the Turks were like, well, maybe we can give it to Russia. And France said, absolutely not. If you give it to Russia, we will start a war against you guys. And so this fighting went back and forth. And finally, Russia just decided to attack. Russia went in and started to invade the northern Ottoman Empire. And at this start of invasion, the French and their partners, Great Britain, joined together to push back the Russians. They were able to push back the Russians out of the Turkish area and back into Russian lands, but they decided, why stop there? We can push them all the way back to their port city, Sevastopol, and take that city so they have no port cities. And that's what they did. They started to fight along this peninsula right here. And this peninsula is known as the Crimean Peninsula, and that's where the war gets its name. This fighting went on for a long time, but it was very unorganized, and both sides were not fighting well and were just in chaos. So eventually, when the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas I, started to have weakening health conditions, his son said, let's end this now. We've been fighting for a long time with no success. Let's just stop. And so they did. And they signed a treaty called the Treaty of Paris. You'll notice that many treaties are called the Treaty of Paris. They're signed there. And in this treaty, Russia got to keep Sevastopol, but they had to return all Turkish lands, and they had to promise to never keep a warship in the Black Sea, which they did. That is the end of this chapter. I'll see you next time for Story of the World Highlights. Bye-bye.